NATO is at war with Moscow. Europe is to blame for prolonging Russia's war against Ukraine. And North Korea, on the contrary, tried to stop the confrontation. These and other fairy tales were voiced by Putin at the Valdai Discussion Club meeting. In his alternative universe, the Russian army is advancing relentlessly along the entire front line. Nothing new. The usual mantras of Kremlin propaganda. After all, admitting that in September alone the Russian army lost 28,000 soldiers, and that the Ukrainian armed forces are carrying out counteroffensive actions in the Donetsk region, is simply beyond him. Let's break down how the Russian dictator lies about the situation at the front, and who is doing everything they can to help him with this. Let's go back 2 months and recall the meeting of the two dictators, Putin and Lukashenko. Sitting on a bench on Dalam Island on August 1st, they discussed the supposedly imminent collapse of Ukrainian defensive lines. As usual, whatever is on Putin's mind is on Lukashenko's tongue. Back then, the Belarusian dictator insisted that Kiev should ask the Kremlin for negotiations, otherwise the Russians would supposedly seize everything soon.
A month and a half, maybe 2, I don't know. There won't even be any defensive structures left there at all. The Russians will slowly bite off, seize everything, and then move on. They'll take back more territory.
2 weeks later, on August 16th to be exact, the Russian dictator went to see the American president to show him his cherished maps, which supposedly display the mythical achievements of the Russian army. The goal is clear: to force the head of the White House to withdraw support for Ukraine and pressure Kiev into accepting terms that benefit Moscow. At a recent press conference, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, Putin assured Trump that in just 2 months, Russia would capture all of eastern Ukraine and advance on Kharkiv, Dnipro, and even Kiev. However, 2 months have passed, and there is still no sign of victory.
They showed some maps. They were showing some maps, very strange diagrams. I've seen a lot, and it's necessary to break down these narratives. And that's exactly what our military is doing. And that's exactly what our diplomatic team is doing.
Even if you rely solely on data from independent OSINT analysts, the situation at the front becomes perfectly clear. In the south, in the Zaporizhzhia direction, the armed forces of Ukraine continue to hold back the aggressors' assault in the area of Orikhiv and Heliopol. Attempts by the Russian command to break through the Ukrainian armed forces' defenses come to nothing. There are simply no strategic successes for Russia to speak of. The same goes for the Kherson region. There, Russian forces keep trying again and again to break through to the right bank of the Dnipro. But despite heavy losses and the use of reserves, they are unable to cross and secure a foothold. The fiercest fighting is taking place in the north and east of the country. That's exactly where Moscow continues to concentrate its main resources. And that's also where the occupiers are suffering their heaviest losses. Of course, the Russian General Staff's reports don't mention any of this.
The enemy planned to achieve success by summer along the main offensive directions, to advance, take control, and by early autumn create a buffer zone in the Kharkiv and Sumy regions, capture the Pokrovsk agglomeration, reach the borders of Donetsk region, and seize a number of territories in the Zaporizhzhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kherson regions. But these enemy plans were not realized thanks to the skillful actions of our soldiers, the competent and well-thought-out decisions of our commanders, the timely implementation of core reform, and the effective strikes against the enemy's rear. It can be said that the Russian spring and summer campaigns have essentially been thwarted. Oleksandr Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, at a meeting with journalists.
The most intense situation is in the Donetsk region. The largest Russian grouping is concentrated in the Pokrovsk area, about 120,000 personnel. Despite this, the Ukrainian army is not only holding back the enemy, but is also advancing. Novkonomik and Yadakny have been liberated, and the situation near Rodensk has been stabilized. In the Dobropilya direction, the initiative clearly belongs to the armed forces of Ukraine. About 180 square kilometers of territory have been liberated. Moreover, some Russian units that tried to break through the defense ended up in an operational encirclement. For an army that Putin declared the strongest in the world, such tactical failures are especially painful.
The Dobropilya counteroffensive operation is ongoing. I want to thank all our engaged units for their effectiveness. Since the beginning of the operation, our forces have already managed to liberate more than 174 square kilometers, and more than 194 kilometers have been cleared of Russian saboteurs. Russian losses in this operation alone are nearly 3,200, and most of them are irrecoverable losses.
In addition to obvious failures at the front, the Kremlin is also suffering humiliating defeats in the rear. According to BBC Verified, since the beginning of 2025, 21 out of 38 of Russia's largest oil refineries, the very ones where crude oil is turned into gasoline and diesel, have been hit. Analysts note that nearly 40% of capacity is currently simply sitting idle. The main reason is the effective and, most importantly, regular attacks by Ukrainian drones on the refineries of the aggressor country. Scheduled maintenance at a number of facilities had to be postponed just to keep production going somehow, according to sources from the Washington Post. Ordinary Russians are feeling the consequences as well. Roughly every 50th gas station in the Russian Federation has suspended gasoline sales, and nationwide fuel production has dropped by almost 10%. Moscow has turned to Minsk for help. In September, fuel imports from Belarus increased by nearly 170% compared to August. But even these volumes are not enough. To meet domestic demand, Energy Minister Alexander Novak suggested expanding gasoline imports, including from China. Russia's energy sector today is like a powder keg, noted the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And this isn't just an isolated failure, but a systemic collapse.
Instead of investing in its own thermal and hydroelectric power plants, Moscow is losing reserves due to sanctions and aging equipment. Modernization is impossible without Western components. Even without Ukrainian strikes, the system is bursting at the seams. That's why, in Putin's actions targeting our energy sector, which the West is helping to restore, there's nothing but sheer idiocy, because it will be extremely difficult for Russians to restore their own energy sector once a symmetrical response kicks in. Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, on Telegram.
But reality doesn't bother the Russian and Belarusian dictators. They keep insisting to anyone willing to listen that the Russian army is invincible. Lukashenko stubbornly repeats that Ukraine supposedly needs to accept Russia's terms. And Putin keeps issuing new ultimatums and coming up with pseudo-pretexts. And why can't he meet one-on-one with the president of Ukraine?
It's hard for me to react in any way to what Lukashenko says. He lives in his own world, he built it and isolated himself. He's been living for 3 decades in this house he built. But this house is the size of an entire country. But I want him to remember that his country is independent. He's in his own world, but sometimes Putin drops by and they chat. 2 old men. It's hard to comment.
Moscow tirelessly tries to impose its own narrative on the world, where defeats are called victories, and devastation in Russia is spun as the success of import substitution and economic resilience. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army continues to hold the line and counterattack at the front. Europe and NATO are strengthening their defenses against Russian hybrid aggression. And all that's left for Putin and Lukashenko are just words and, of course, their beloved maps.